Welcome to the INFOWARS Nightly News. I'm David Knight. It's Monday, June 15th, 2015. Here are top stories.
Tonight, rioting migrants attempt to hijack trucks heading for the UK. Then, Prime Minister David Cameron flubs the Magna Carta. And a hard look at Jade Helm 15. That's next on the INFOWARS Nightly News.
So see, they're lying to us. Their own Jade Helm handout says the things we've said, and then they tell the media it doesn't exist.
It was 800 years ago today that King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta. Now, of course, that is really the Magna Carta Libertatum, the big charter of liberty. Today, we have a lot of big charters being put before us, big charters of tyranny. I guess you could call them the Magna Carta Tyrannus, or whatever the Latin is. It was a situation 800 years ago like we're seeing today. Arbitrary use of power, massive increase in taxes. And so the people came to King John and they established this charter. Now, the BBC asks, what is the big deal about the Magna Carta? It is a big deal in America, even a bigger deal in America than it is in the UK, because we have utilized it as our founding document. It has set a pattern establishing the rule of law as being above those who are our leaders. That has resulted in a document that is itself the king. The colonists called it Lex Rex. That's what the Constitution is fundamentally about. Now, in this article from the BBC, they point out that even the door of the U.S. Supreme Court shows King John of England being coerced by the barons to place his seal on the Magna Carta. Now, they point out, and as I said before, it's bigger here than it is in England. They say only 3 of the clauses are still in effect in England, but we have in the U.S. 17 out of the 50 states refer to the Magna Carta on their statute books. That's why Americans hold this so dearly. It established the rule of law. It established the rule of law over the king. It established what was legitimate authority. Now, we have an article up on INFOWARS.com today. David Cameron was clueless on the Magna Carta when he was questioned by David Letterman a couple of years ago in 2012. David Letterman asked him some questions about it. Of course, he knew where it was signed, or I should say sealed, because the king didn't actually sign it. He just stamped it with his seal. He knew where it was sealed. He knew when it was sealed, but he didn't even know what Magna Carta meant. He didn't even know that it meant big charter, let alone the liberty part of it. So it's kind of puzzling that he would hold up today that they're going to have a British Bill of Rights that is going to supersede the human rights coming out of the European Union. He says that they need to have local rule, and I agree with that. But when he doesn't understand what the document is about, when they have not produced a British Bill of Rights, it makes you question what their commitment is to the Bill of Rights, especially when we look at the way they have treated privacy and the rule of law and due process in that country, as they have in America as well. Now, there's an article on WorldNet Daily. Bill Federer points out what the parallels are to the Magna Carta and our Constitution. And of course, it's not just the fact that we are establishing that the rule of law is preeminent even over the leaders of the country, but there's a lot of parallels. It's also the source for much of our Bill of Rights of our Constitution. For example, he says in the 12th clause, no tax shall be imposed in the kingdom, this is from the original document, unless by common council of our kingdom is reflected in the revolutionary phrase, no taxation without representation, and that the government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. In addition to that, they say a free man shall be fined only in proportion to the degree of his offense. We have excessive bail will not be required. That's in the Bill of Rights. In the original Magna Carta, it says, no constable or other bailiff shall take corn or other provisions from anyone without immediately tendering money. It says, we have now, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Of course, that's recently been overturned, hasn't it? In Kello at the Supreme Court, we've also seen eminent domain being overturned in the Keystone Pipeline case. We now have given the power not only to a private corporation to take someone else's private property for private use, we have now extrapolated that to multinational corporations, giving TransCanada, the runner of the Keystone Pipeline, the capability to come in and condemn property to take it by eminent domain from family farms, many of whom have had those farms for hundreds of years. One more here. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed without force against him except by lawful judgment of his equals. And again, that's from the Magna Carta. We have that you will have a due process, of course, under the 14th Amendment. There's also parallels with the First Amendment as well. The English church shall be free and shall have rights undiminished and its liberties unimpaired. That's the First Amendment, which is freedom of religion. It's not freedom from religion. It is a wall of separation that protects the religious practices of people from incursion by the state. In another article at INFOWARS.com, Magna Carta at 800, a promise unfulfilled. Yes, it is definitely unfulfilled. And this is an interview Real News Network did with Michael Ratner, president for the Center for Constitutional Rights. And he points out what Frederick Douglass, a slave, said. And if you remember, of course, when we had the Magna Carta, this was essentially establishing the rights only for those noblemen. It didn't really affect the common man. That expanded over the centuries until by the time our country was founded, it affected all free people, but it did not affect slaves. And that was the point that Frederick Douglass made in the 1850s. He was asked to address a 4th of July celebration. And he said, people in the United States were still enslaved at that point. He said, millions of slaves. What does this say about it? He said, your 4th of July is a sham. Your boasted liberty is an unholy license for enslaving blacks. Your shouts of liberty and equality are a hollow mockery. Now, Ratner says we could say the same thing today. We could say, when we look at the people that have been tortured, who remain imprisoned at Guantanamo, the 2 million that are imprisoned in the United States, how does the land of the free have the greatest number of people in prison? By far, the highest percentage of any country in prison. Yes, the land of the free. Murdered by drones, murdered by police, killed in unlawful wars. Yes, the Magna Carta and our Constitution have become a sham. That doesn't mean that we ignored them. They are still a guideline. They are still a template for where we need to be. What it does is it exposes the criminal actions of our current leaders who are in every way as bad as King John was. And he points out that there was another aspect of this time, something that most people are not talking about. When we look at the Magna Carta, as we began the program, we showed that it was on the door of the Supreme Court, the signing at Runnymede. But there was something else that happened at that time as well. Certainly the Magna Carta laid out judicial principles, civil liberties principles, but there were also economic issues as well. Everyone knows the story of Robin Hood, how they were prohibited from taking any game or any lumber off of the king's land because he asserted ownership over everything. Doesn't that sound familiar today? As I said at the beginning, we are looking at a charter of tyranny that is being expressed worldwide in these global trade agreements, the transatlantic, the trans-Pacific partnerships that are going to be greased through without going through the due process that is required in the Constitution for passing these treaties. Those treaties are set up to return to the kind of feudalism that we saw before the Magna Carta, where the king, actually in this case, it's going to be corporate barons, will assert ownership over everything. Now, Ratner pointed out in this commentary that at the time the Magna Carta was signed, there was also another bill that was very important for economic rights, and that was the Treaty of the Forest, the Charter of the Forest. It proclaimed at roughly the same time economic rights. He said they were then given the right to chop wood. They were able to use that wood to build their homes. They were able to take part of the forest, as against the king, who at one time claimed all of that forest. They were allowed to take honey out of the forest. They were allowed to have rights of economic survival. That's where we need to be today. And that's precisely what these transatlantic, trans-Pacific partnerships that they have created are designed to take away. They're designed to hand over ownership, whether it's perpetual copyright over drugs or perpetual copyright over songs or movies. They want to have copyright ownership over everything, even your truck, as we've pointed out in many times. Your John Deere tractor, your personal vehicle, they assume that you are going to be merely leasing that vehicle from them because they own the copyright to the software that monitors and controls the engine. That's where they want to go. We have to understand that, and we have to understand where we need to go. Wise and just men have laid out the pattern for where we need to return to. and we need to take it in that direction. It's an opposite direction from where we're going. One last point that he makes. He says the American Bar Association erected a statue there at Runnymede, and the motto on it says, freedom under the law. And he points out that the Magna Carta was a struggle of the barons against the authority of the king. He says it was against authority. He says, so what this monument there should have said was authority under law. In other words, our authorities, our police, our Homeland Security, our FBI, our president, our Department of Justice are under the law themselves, as well as all of these bureaucracies. That is really the kind of charter that we need to have. Now, one of the things we need to remember, it was not the right to keep and bear arms was not part of the Magna Carta. It is part of our recognized fundamental rights, but we see in the Magna Carta that that was how they established their liberties, was through the force of arms. It was really only buying time when King John put his seal to it, because within 3 months, he had gone back to war with the noblemen. And that would have turned into a very violent civil war, probably with France taking over the country, if he hadn't died quickly and his son, who was 9 years old, succeeded him. That consolidated the country, and it also consolidated the Charter of Liberties. But when we look at the Second Amendment today, that is what establishes and holds the rest of our liberties. We see from New American that a federal judge has tossed out the Brady campaign lawsuit over Kansas's Second Amendment law. Now, what did the Brady campaign find to be offensive in this Kansas law? Well, they say the law said any act, treaty, order, rule, or regulation by the government of the United States which violates the Second Amendment of the United States is null, void, and unenforceable in the state of Kansas. So that's what they objected to, that any regulation by our government or any treaty that they might sign, like the UN Arms Trade Treaty or these Trans-Pacific, Transatlantic partnerships, which are really treaties, that's the fundamental lie underlying them. If they sign any kind of regulation, pass any kind of law, the preeminent law of the land, the king of the land, the king that every one of them swears allegiance to as condition of taking their office. Lex Rex, the supreme law of the land, is the Constitution. And that's what the Brady bill has a problem with. Now, the Brady group, I should say, of course, they did get the Brady bill passed. It was some time after Ronald Reagan's press secretary, Brady, was shot. We just see this article coming out of the Daily Mail. The president, Ronald Reagan, always carried a pistol with him. How about that? That's outlawed in Washington, D.C. I guess they wouldn't dare go after him, but he says this is a writer, Brad Meltzer, who is doing research for a book called The President's Shadow. He talked to Secret Service agents, and they told him that President Reagan always carried a gun with him at all times. He carried it in his briefcase. He never left the White House without it. It was a .38 caliber pistol. He even took it on Air Force One. Well, that's right, because he was within his rights. I'm sure that if he'd been someone of lesser stature and they had found that, they would go after him, as we've seen many times with their draconian legislation. Of course, they allow TV anchors and journalists to violate their laws live on air, but other people who even have non-functioning, empty, spent shotgun shells have seen the wrath of the D.C. lawyers. One of the things they said in this that I thought was kind of interesting, they said Reagan was the first president in office to survive an assassination attempt. Actually, no, he wasn't. In 1835, Andrew Jackson was someone who attempted to shoot him as he was leaving the Capitol. The gun misfired. Andrew Jackson started fighting with him. He pulled out a second pistol, and that second Derringer also misfired, at which point he was subdued and taken away. 100 years later, they say the Smithsonian took these Derringers out, and they both fired immediately the first try. So what are the chances of that happening, that they would not fire? Well, somebody calculated that and said it was 1 in 125,000. Maybe we've seen God's providence the first time in taking down the second bank of the United States, because this assassination attempt happened 1 year before the charter was to expire. And of course, Andrew Jackson, one of the key things that he was fighting was the bankers. He was going to take down that national bank, that central bank in the United States. When we come back, we're going to talk about what's happening with the bankers in Greece. It looks like this